Ezekiel 33:3.
Okay, welcome to the Wednesday Bible studies. Today we're doing Genesis chapters 12 to 17. So the agenda is we're going to review the study from last week. We'll look at the genealogy of Adam. We have to get really good with the genealogy because since we're dealing with a real story and real history, the more names we know, the easier we'll be able to look through history books and find these people. We'll take a look at overview of Genesis chapters 12 to 17. So that was our reading for this week. We'll look at questions from the study, if there's any questions that came in, and then reading for next week. So if you do have a question from this study or in general, you can send a question to the chat, actually, and then from the chat, I'll take a look at it from there and then answer your question. And then we'll take a look at our reading for next week. So review from last study, we took a look at the genealogy from Adam to the flood. We examined the dimensions of the ark, a cubit, and a full-scale replica. We looked at what went into the ark, clean and unclean. Also, keep in mind that when things were going into the ark, the animals, we're talking about types, not species. It's a very different conversation. The windows of heaven and the fountains of earth, when we talked about the earth being flooded, we pointed out those places below and above where the water was coming from. And then we looked at the duration of the flood and some of the major dates. We also looked at the sign of the covenant following the flood. So we looked at the rainbow. The table of nations following the flood. That's where you saw the lineages that were coming from Japheth, Ham, and Shem. The building of the Tower of Babel and the city. So there was a tower and a city. We looked in the splitting of the tongues into 70 and the people being scattered across the earth. So at this time, we saw that there was only one language on the whole earth. And then at Babylon, we had 70 angels come and then split the people and scatter them. And then we took a look at the words Ben Elohim or Benai Elohim, which means sons of God. And we looked at the word Nephilim, and Nephilim was in Genesis 6:4. So we identified Benai Elohim as angels, as they are in the book of Job. And then we took a look at the word Nephilim and Gigantes and giants. And we found an interesting thing about the giants. The giants, based on Greek mythology, based on the word Gigantes, did not necessarily mean that the people had to be tall. There were areas in the Bible where we saw that the giants or the Nephilim were taller than normal individuals. However, before the flood and after the flood, we noticed there was a change. They weren't as tall. We also noticed that just in the descriptions in the dictionaries, the Nephilim didn't necessarily have to be gigantic. They just could be. So we're going to start first with our genealogy of Adam. We'll go from Adam right to the flood again. So we'll look at not every name on the lineage, but we'll look at some very key names. We've got Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel. Cain kills Abel, and then they have another child, which is Seth. Then we get to Genesis 4:26, and we see Enosh. Enosh is a very important child because that was the times when people started to first use that word Lord or Yahweh or Jehovah. First time it shows up in the Bible. Problem being is that it wasn't actually given to the people. The people just had the name. And remember, this happened after Genesis 3, so it's quite likely this came from the serpent. And we saw in the 1611 King James Bible that when we looked in the days of Enosh in Genesis 4:26, they had translated in the side notes that people had began to call themselves God. So in other words, they started to become their own idol. We see in the days of Jared, that's Genesis 6:4. So that's when the sons of God and the daughters of man, so in other words, angels and humans come together and they make some kind of a new creation. And then we see a couple generations later, we have Noah in Genesis 6:8. So whatever started in the days of Jared reached a point where both the gene pool and people's behavior had reached a very pivotal low. So this is what led to the flood. And then we have Noah, his wife, and then his 3 sons and their wives all enter the ark. We're going to start with Genesis chapter 12, and we'll do an overview of Genesis 12, and we'll look at all the travels on the map as well. So we're starting off in Ur of Chaldees. You could look at this as Babylon. Basically, Ur of Chaldees or Babylon. This was the area in which Abraham was born. So Abraham was born in Ur. And if you take a look, you can see Ur right down here near the bottom. In Genesis 11:31-32, Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son's Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Okay, so when we look back at our lineages, Terah was the father of Noah. Terah was the father of Abram. Abram also had a brother. His brother's name was Haran. Haran had died early. Haran had actually died before his father Terah. So Terah had been taking care of Haran's son Lot. So this would have been his grandson, Abraham's nephew. And then as Terah passes, you find that Lot is now under the guidance of Abram. So Lot was originally the child of Haran. As a matter of fact, I think if we go back, we can see on the map here, Ur is right down here. This is where Abraham was born. And then up here, Haran. Haran was actually named after his brother. And so they had traveled to Haran, the place that was named after his brother. And that was where his father Terah died. And so here's the path from Ur up through Babylon, Mari, and then to Haran. In Haran, this is where the Lord calls Abram to the land of Canaan. So at this point, Abram has a vision, and then he's told to leave Haran and then make his way down into the land of Canaan, which was later called the Promised Land. In Genesis 12:4-6, it says, So Abram went as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran. And they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Morah at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. So from Haran, you can see that Abram and Lot and all their possessions, they traveled down to this area called Shechem. And you can see Shechem here. It's actually just left of Bethel. So Abraham builds an altar in Shechem. We read that in Genesis 12:6. And then we see that Abraham moves farther south between Bethel and Ai. That was in Genesis 12:8. So Shechem is just a little bit towards the north, and then down south past this hill country, you can see Bethel and Ai. This is where Abram set up his tent. So he set up a tent between Bethel and Ai, and he set up an altar in Shechem, because Shechem was the first place that he stopped when he entered the land of Canaan. Abram carries on southwest and towards the land of Negev. We read this in Genesis 12:9. And so if you take a look beneath Shechem and Bethel and Ai, you can see that this area in the south is called the Negev. It's where Beersheba is. Then there's a severe famine that occurs in the land of Canaan, and then Abraham goes into Egypt. We read about this in Genesis 12:10. And so now from Negev, you can see Abraham make his way with Lot across the wilderness of Sur, all the way over to Egypt. Abram tells the Pharaoh that his wife is a sister, which leads to the Pharaoh becoming diseased by God. When Pharaoh finds out, he sends away Abram with his things. So as they were entering Egypt, Abraham was concerned that his wife, being as attractive as she was, might end up leading to his death. And so his plan was to call his wife a sister, come to Egypt. And obviously when the king takes his wife to his chamber, and all of a sudden these horrible things start to happen to him, the king realizes that the sister is actually not the sister, but the wife, and that it was Abram's God, which was unleashing all of his fury against him. And so at this point, this is when the Pharaoh tells Abraham to take his stuff and get going. And not only did Abraham leave with all of his things and his wife and Lot, he left with additional things. So the king in Egypt, or the Pharaoh in Egypt, gave Abraham additional possessions. So Abraham came back with more than what he left with. He came back with Hagar, for example. She's a slave maid that you read about in later chapters. So when they leave from Egypt, they return back to Negev and then slowly make their way back up to Hebron. So in Genesis 12, the overview is that God called Abram from the land of his fathers into Canaan, the land of Israel. God blessed Abram and told him he would be a great nation. Abram was 75 when he left Haran, and he took his nephew Lot with him. The Lord appeared to Abram at Shechem and told him that he would receive the land, and Abram built an altar to the Lord there. Abram carried on and pitched his tent between Bethel and Ai, and then Abram carries on into the land of Negev. A severe famine occurs, then Abram and Lot go into Egypt, and then Abram pretended his wife was his sister while they were in Egypt. The king found out Sarah was Abram's wife and told him to leave Egypt as well as take many possessions with him. So that's how Abraham accumulated these extra slave maids and just possessions that he was taking with him back to Negev. Overview of Genesis chapter 13. So this is where you see Abraham and Lot. They're in Negev, and at this point they have a lot of possessions. They make their way up farther north towards Mamre, and this is the discussion that is had. After Abram has his time of prayer, Lot and Abram's, I guess you could call them their shepherds and servants, they were fighting over the land because the animals all had to graze. And so with all the possessions they had, they couldn't be in the one space. And so Abram, being the peacemaker, decides, let's not fight amongst each other. This land is big enough to contain both of us. And so at this point, Abraham and Lot disband. They separate with their separate possessions. In Genesis 13:8-9, it says, so Abraham said to Lot, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is it not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. So Abraham gives Lot open game here. He says, you can choose whatever part of the land that you'd like. In Genesis 13:10, Lot looked around and saw the whole plain of Jordan towards Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Genesis 13:8, so Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tents, and there he built his altar to the Lord. So if you take a look here, this is where Abraham had set up. So if you see by the Dead Sea, to the left of the Dead Sea was this area called Mamre. These are what the oaks look like at Mamre. They're quite memorable in regards to the size of the tree. You'll notice that Lot, though, didn't go to Mamre. He chose the land Zoar, or the area close to the Jordan Valley. So if you take a look here at the map, you can see Jordan, where we have Jordan today. Jordan used to be called Edom. Obviously, Edom was smaller than Jordan. Jordan is much larger than Edom. But Edom or Jordan, this is the area where Lot was going towards, actually right beneath Beersheba here. So if you look, here's Beersheba. At the bottom here of the Dead Sea, this is where you'd find this area called Zoar. So basically in Jordan, right at the tip of the lake there, that's where Zoar is supposed to be on the map. So overview of Genesis 13. Abram and Lot return to Negev. Abram returns between Bethel and Ai, where he set up his tent. Lot and Abram choose land and then separate. Lot went towards the Jordan Valley in the direction of Zoar and the cities as far as Sodom. The Lord told Abram he and his offspring would rule the land of Canaan forever. Abram built an altar to the Lord at Mamre. We're going to look at Genesis chapter 14 now. So this is the valley of Siddim. So when we're looking at Genesis chapter 14, it starts off where basically you have 4 kings versus 5 kings. These 4 kings versus 5 kings duke it out in this area called the Valley of Siddim. And if you take a look at the map, again, at the bottom of the Dead Sea, where you can see Sodom, just to the left of it, that's where you would have the Valley of Siddim. So in the Valley of Siddim, there was this great battle. They brought their horses, they brought their swords. They went to battle, the 4 kings versus the 5. The kings of Sodom, they were in the group that had lost. After the fight was over, what ended up happening was all the possessions were taken from Sodom, Gomorrah, and the losing kingdoms. Since Lot was amongst those people, Lot was taken as part of the tribute. So his possessions, his wife, his people, and himself, They were all taken, and they were taken going up north past Damascus. And so then Abraham got men together, and then they went up and they fetched him from this area called Hobah, which is just north of Damascus, and then brought him back down to Mamre, where he was residing. We also see Abraham is blessed by Melchizedek. It's actually the first time you see that in the Bible. The word itself shows up twice in the Bible. There's not really much you can do with the word, but I will explain to you what you can make of the word. There's a lot of, I've seen some pretty elaborate Sabbath studies or just Bible studies in general on this word Melchizedek, except the problem is they're not pulling from the Bible. They're pulling from a whole plethora of different sources that aren't the Bible. So like I said, when it comes to Melchizedek, it shows up twice in the Bible. So I'll show you exactly what it says in the Bible, and then I'll tell you what I think it means. So when we look at the word Melchizedek, it's two words put together, Malki and Chezdek. So Malki or Melech means king. And so here what the definition is, it says Melchizedek is my king is right, an early king of Salem. And if we look at the second part of the word, which is Chezdek, it means righteousness or rightness. So in other words, when we look at Melchizedek, Malek means king and Chezdek means righteous. It means the king of righteousness. That's exactly what's being said. So the king of righteousness came and blessed Abraham. The Midrash, which is a text outside of the Bible, it's like a Hebrew commentary. This is something the rabbis would look at. I don't commonly deal with the Midrash, but I do agree with the explanation given from the Midrash. The Midrash claims that Melchizedek was actually Shem. So you had Japheth, Ham, and Shem. This order of Melchizedek, this order of righteousness, was going down through Shem. If you remember, after Noah got off the ark, he planted a vineyard, and then he got drunk. And then his son had done something to him, which was Ham. And then Ham was cursed, or at least his child, Canaan, was cursed. And so it would make sense that since Shem and Japheth were the children that came and picked their father off the ground in the tent and covered his shame, those two children would obviously be separated from the child that was cursed, or Canaan in this case that was cursed. So the idea of Shem being associated to righteousness, it's extremely likely. As a matter of fact, you'll also read in the book of Jasher. In the book of Jasher, it'll talk a little bit more about Shem. It actually mentioned that when Abraham was growing up, he was raised partially by Shem because his father, Terah, was into the worship of idols. So the king of Babylon at the time had many different gods that he worshipped and many different idols. If you remember, Abraham grew up in Ur. Ur is Chaldea, which is Babylon. And so his father, wanting to fit in with all the king and the nobles, he had possessed a series of different idols, and he had filled his house with those idols. And in the book of Jasher, you actually read that his house had burned down. His house had burned down with his idols inside of them, and that was the father of Abram. So Abram was actually raised by Shem. And so the idea of Shem blessing Abram as Melchizedek makes a lot of sense, because if the priesthood, remember, the priesthood came through the Levites. And if we're looking at Abraham, we haven't even hit Isaac yet. Isaac, Jacob, and then you get Levi. So at this point, we don't even have a priesthood. So this Melchizedek priesthood, it obviously is much, much older than the Levites, because here we're seeing generations before the Levites, the idea of a priest. And the only one that would really make sense to apply to would be Shem. In Psalms 110, 1-4, it's the only other place in the Bible you'll find the word Melchizedek. It says, "The Lord said to my Lord," so this is a psalm of David, "Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. The Lord extends your mighty scepter from Zion. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Your people will be willing on your day of battle, arrayed in holy splendor. From the womb of the dawn, to you belongs the dew of your youth. The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." So this is the only other verse in the Bible you'll see this word Melchizedek. And again, it brings up the idea of a priesthood, which means that there was a priesthood before the priesthood. So there's a priesthood before the Levites. This verse actually connects to another verse in the Bible, which is Hebrews 5, 1-10. It says, "Every high priest is appointed from among men to represent them in matters relating to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins." So if we take a look here, that first sentence is pretty loaded. The high priest is supposed to do what? Represent men in matters relating to God, offer gifts, and offer sacrifices. That's the role of the priest right there. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and misguided, since he himself is beset by weakness. That is why he is obligated to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as the sins of his people. No one takes this honor upon himself. He must be called by God, just as Aaron was. So also, Christ did not take upon himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but he was called by the one who said to him, "You are my son. Today I have become your father." Okay, so this is important. We see here with Aaron was appointed to be a high priest. So Aaron was a Levite. And we saw this when we were dealing with Moses and looking at, actually, we'll deal with this more when we go into Exodus and we look at the story of Moses and the Exodus out of Egypt. But we can see that this position of high priest is an appointed position by God. And if we look at the book of Leviticus, Leviticus comes from the words Vayikra, or the first words of Leviticus are Vayikra, which means "and he called." So that means "and he called the priesthood." So "and he called the priesthood," but here we can see Christ was also one who was called. And we're reading this in Hebrews. It goes on and says, and in another passage, God says, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." So here we're talking about Christ, and we're talking about first that Aaron was appointed to be high priest, and then Christ was appointed. And then here we're seeing that Christ is seen as a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. So the same line that was coming through Shem, that went down through David, is now coming right through Christ. During the days of Jesus' earthly life, he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from what he had suffered. And having been made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, and was designated by God as high priest in the order of Melchizedek. Okay, so we can see Shem was part of this order of Melchizedek. Now from Shem, if we go down through the lineage and go to Christ, we're not coming through the Levites at all. We're actually coming through Judah. Because if we take a look, Judah is the bloodline of kings, and Levites were the bloodline of priests. What we have here is we have Christ, who is from a bloodline of kings, being treated as a high priest. So that means Christ is both priest, high priest, and king. Hebrews 4:14-16. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weakness, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. Let us approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. So again, this confirmation that Christ, even though he's from a bloodline of kings, which is Judah, he's still a high priest. Revelation 19:16. On his robe and on his thigh, he has the name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Forgive the extra D. So Christ is a priest. He's the high priest. He's the high priest of the order of Melchizedek. And obviously this must have come from before the times of Abram. And if we're going to look before the times of Abram as someone who is going to be a priest of God, it's likely going to be Shem. And so likely it came from Shem. It went through Judah. And then through the bloodline of kings, we have our king who is also the high priest. But Christ isn't just king and high priest. Christ was also a prophet. Christ was the greatest of the prophets. As a matter of fact, when you read about the tribulation, that is a prophecy. So he is a king, he is a high priest, and he is a prophet. Genesis 14 overview. The kings of Canaan and Shinar go into battle in the valley of Shittim, so 4 against 5. When the kingdom of Sodom lost, Lot was taken with the spoils. A man who escaped told Abram everything that had happened. Abram rounded up 318 men and retrieved Lot from Hobah, north of Damascus, bringing him back with his possessions and people. After Abram defeated, and let me try to pronounce this, Chedorlaomer, and the kings that were with him, he blessed him by Melchizedek. Abram took the people, gave 1/10 of the possessions to Melchizedek, leaving the rest. Now this is also interesting. So when Abraham had all these spoils that he obviously got from defeating these other kings in battle who had defeated the king of Sodom and Gomorrah and the other kings he was banded with, the spoils that were left behind Abraham took none for himself. And he took none from himself, so that way the king of Babylon couldn't have said, look, you became rich off of my riches. So what Abraham did was he gave all the possessions back, with the exception of some spoils for the men, but he took 1/10 of the possessions and he gave them to Melchizedek. So in this case, it looks like he gave them to Shem. The fact that it's 1/10 is very important, because what we see here is we see Melchizedek is a high priest. Well, when you're dealing with the number of a tenth and a high priest, what you're talking about is a tithe. Even though Melchizedek is not connected to the Levites weren't even born yet, we can already see that this high priest is getting his 1/10, his tithe. Overview of Genesis chapter 15. So this is where we see the covenant with Abram. And this covenant, basically what God does is Abram's looking at the sky and he sees all these stars throughout the sky. At this time, Abram has no child. And so while looking at the stars, the Lord promises him that he will be a nation that's as great as these stars in the sky. They would have as many ancestors as the stars in the sky. Obviously, being 90 years old with no heirs at this point, a little bit concerning for Abram, and he's trying to make sense of this prophecy that the Lord has told him. God promises Abram an heir and as many descendants as the stars in the sky. Abram is told his ancestors would be foreigners in a land and servants for 400 years during the wickedness of the Amorites. This is something I have to look into a little bit longer, because I didn't realize that at the same time the people were going into Egypt, there was something going on in the land of Canaan regarding the Amorites. Abram was told that the land would come under judgment, and his people would leave there with great possessions. So that's what we take a look at in Exodus. What we're seeing here in the earlier chapters of Genesis is the idea that after their 400 years of bondage in Egypt, when the people left, they would leave with possessions of the Pharaoh. Abram's told that he will one day possess the land of Canaan in all directions. So the north, east, south, west, God is describing using the Euphrates as like a benchmark, how far his borders would extend from north, east, south, and west of this land he would possess someday. But this obviously was going to happen after they had been in another land. In Genesis chapter 16, we looked at Hagar going into Shur. And the reason why is because, well, first off, let's look at where Hagar came from. Hagar was acquired when they were in Egypt. So when Lot and Abraham had made their way down from Negev and there was a famine, and then they made their way into Egypt, this was the period of time when Abraham had pretended that his wife was his sister. When they left, what they acquired was maidservants and manservants and a whole bunch of possessions. And one of the maidservants that Abraham had acquired was Hagar. And so Hagar became the, I guess you could call her chambermaid, slave maid, or maidservant of his wife Sarah. And when Sarah was barren and Hagar was obviously fertile, Sarah made the decision to give her maidservant Hagar to her husband Abraham. Abraham had a child, or at least he got Hagar pregnant, and this is the point where we see Hagar make her way into Shur. Obviously, Sarah, being barren, was very jealous of the fact that Hagar was able to bear a child, and the fact that she was carrying her husband's, or the fact that Hagar was carrying her husband's child, made her very upset. And so eventually what ended up happening was the tension between Hagar and Sarah led to Hagar eventually just leaving. So she went off to this area called Shur. So you'll notice here, actually, when you're coming from Israel and you're making your way into Egypt, you cross through this area called Shur. Shur is called the wilderness of Sur. And this area, actually, if you take a look where Sur is and kind of coming down on the edge here where the Red Sea is, this is quite often where you would see a lot of presence of the Ishmaelites. So you would either see the Ishmaelites. There was another name actually that shows up too with Moses. Moses had a father-in-law called Jethro. This was the area where it says alternate Shur. That was around the area where Moses had went when he was fleeing from Egypt. Overview of Genesis 16. Sarah was barren and offered her slave maid Hagar to her husband. Hagar conceived, and Sarah dealt harshly with her. Hagar fled to Shur, where she encountered an angel. The angel told her to return, submit, and she would be blessed with many ancestors. Abram has a child with Hagar and named Ishmael when he was 86. So one of the things the angel had told Hagar was the fact that not only if she returned and submit, things would go well. It was along the lines of the same promise that was made to Abraham was also made to Hagar. The same way that Abraham was going to be a father of many nations, the same thing was said to Hagar. So Hagar was the mother of Ishmael, and Ishmael actually fathered these 12, the same way you have Jacob following these 12 tribes and was renamed Israel. You'll find with Ishmael, Ishmael also had these 12 sons. And so you'll see on both sides, whether you're following from Isaac and Jacob or whether you're looking at Ishmael, you'll see this number 12 come up. Chapter 17. Chapter 17 deals with circumcision, the covenant of circumcision. As a matter of fact, here is an Egyptian hieroglyphic showing circumcision. The Egyptians did the exact same thing. I've often questioned whether or not the Egyptians had learned it from the Jews, or whether they were doing this prior to the Jews. I don't have enough knowledge to say. My belief is that they would have learned it from the Jews, because the Jews had spent 400 years living in Egypt. In Genesis 17, we see Abraham becomes Abraham. So this is the first time he's called Abraham. He's called Abraham prior to this, and this was at 90 years of age. Abraham receives the covenant of circumcision. The covenant was on the 8th day. Children and foreigners were to be circumcised or cut off from the people, meaning that if the people weren't circumcised, they were supposed to be removed from everyone else. Sarah is told that she will have a child in a year's time. Sarah is told her child will father 12 princes. So her immediate child, Isaac, isn't who fathered the 12 princes. It was Israel, which is Jacob. And so it goes Sarah having her child Isaac, Isaac has Jacob, and this is where these 12 princes come from. And then Ishmael and Abraham were circumcised. So both Muslims and Jews do practice circumcision, and it comes right here from Genesis 17. Ishmael was circumcised just like his father was. Now, circumcision brings up a lot of questions. I'm not going to answer them all today, but I will just bring up some basics. The circumcision described in the Old Testament, we have to understand the times that they were living in and kind of put our minds there. I think the best way to kind of approach it is to first start off and let's look at some of the things that happened prior in Genesis. Let's look at what happened before the flood. Before the flood, we had all this iniquity. We had an issue, obviously, with people calling themselves God. That was in Genesis 4:26. We had an issue in Genesis 6:4, which had something to do with creating a whole other creation. And then we find a few generations later, the world becomes so full of wickedness, it just has to be destroyed and reset. So what likely happened is in Genesis 6:4, since we're dealing with some kind of a sexual sin, you have to look. Sex itself is the sign of a creator. That's when you're having sex and you're creating a child. That's the same thing as it's a very powerful act. And so, of course, if you have something like that that's being abused, there would be a symbol that would be associated to it. So you can't get it from before the flood, but you can find it after the flood. When you start to look at some of the religious practices of nations that existed after the flood that have overlaps with things that were going on before the flood, you will see the idea of orgies being practiced in different nations. Greeks, for example, were practicers of something called sex magic or orgies or tantric sex. One of the things that would separate, obviously, a people if they were to go to one of these types of gatherings is the fact that if the men, if they were naked and they looked different, they would stand out like a sore thumb. As a matter of fact, in Rome, we see this actually happening when Jews were living in Rome or in the Roman Empire later in the Bible. What you actually saw was men stretching what was left of their foreskin to try to reconstruct it, because the Romans and the Greeks, they looked at it as shameful if a man was circumcised. For them to stand in the nude with the whole phallus being uncovered, it was supposed to be something very uncivilized. So people would go as far as to wear strings and then pull what was ever left of the foreskin down, or in some cases, I've heard even aprons. And in Freemasonry, you'll see the sign of the apron. As a matter of fact, that goes all the way back to Genesis. In Genesis, after Adam and Eve were naked, what happened was there was a sacrifice, and then they were given animal skins. Well, that animal skin is likely where the Masonic apron came from. As a matter of fact, I've read that's where the Masonic apron came from. So my assumption based on the circumcision is that if you wanted to have a group of people that were separate from the actions of what was going on with the other nations, a mark like that would be very profound. And the reason being is that the surrounding nations, they were looking at the earth and the stars and the creation as being alive. And so what they did was they started to personify the sun, the moon, the stars, and the earth as living creatures. By doing that, they started basically recreating fertility rituals of nature, but in real life. So the same way you would see the summer and the winter and the seasons change, they would do these fertility rituals at certain times of the year, such as the Passover, which you do read later in the Bible. And so, of course, if you were to have a Jewish man be at one of these rituals, it would be quite well known that they were Jewish and that they had a different God than obviously the people that were there. So, visibly speaking, for the times that these people were living in, that mark would mean quite a bit, because if they were gathered amongst people from the other nations, when they were involved in their different practices and fertility rituals, it'd be very evident exactly who was a Jew and who was not a Jew. Once you get into the New Testament, though, you start to realize that the circumcision that's being discussed in the Old Testament, which was an outward removing of the skin, is something very different in the New Testament. It actually goes all the way back to Isaac. We'll cover it a little bit later, but I'll give you some details of it. The circumcision that's spoken about in the Bible when we talk about the New Testament and the new covenant under Christ was not just a physical marking. As a matter of fact, God was smart enough to realize that the physical marking, it didn't stop anyone from doing anything. Just because you were circumcised didn't mean you were going to keep the law. So, and vice versa. Just because a Gentile living in the New Testament was not circumcised, that didn't mean they were not going to keep the law. And so what you saw the real meaning behind the symbol of the circumcision. The circumcision was a symbol that was actually pointing towards the heart. We find that in Exodus, the Pharaoh has a hardened heart. And so what happens is when the Pharaoh has a hardened heart, the people go through all this calamity. When people have a soft heart, you find in the Bible that they're listening to God. When people have a hardened heart, they aren't listening to God. So the Pharaoh was not listening to God. And this is how exactly the Israelites were able to go on their exodus from Egypt. When we look at this in the New Testament and we start looking at the child Isaac, what's very interesting about Isaac, which is Abraham's son, we haven't got there yet, but Abraham is put in this position where his son, which took almost a lifetime here for him to have, he's put in the position where he has to sacrifice his son. The interesting thing about Isaac is Isaac, knowing that his father is going to sacrifice him, agrees and thinks it's a good idea because he trusts his father knows what God wants and he trusts that God is God. So Isaac was very different in the sense that the people before, they were very stubborn. As a matter of fact, the language in the Bible is they'll use the word stiff-necked. The people were very stiff-necked. We saw that quite often. And so when someone wasn't stiff-necked, we would say that they had a soft heart or they had a heart that was circumcised. And that's the language that's used in the New Testament. And so Isaac was actually a very early example of a follower who had a circumcised heart. He didn't understand. He knew that death was approaching, and he still allowed his father to put him up on an altar and just about sacrifice him. So Isaac is basically the idea of someone who isn't circumcised in the flesh, but someone who is circumcised in the spirit. And so when we look in the New Testament, the circumcision that God was always looking for wasn't a circumcision of the body in regards to the outward flesh, but a circumcision of the heart. Once we go into Isaac and we start dealing a little bit more with the story of Isaac, we'll come back onto this topic about circumcision. But ultimately speaking, in the earlier times, it was a physical marking, which I think was supposed to separate people from some of the activities that were happening around them, the surrounding nations and their different fertility activities. And then in the New Testament and the New Covenant, we find that the circumcision, this outward removal of flesh, isn't mandatory. As a matter of fact, these days, there really wouldn't be a situation where men would be surrounded by other men in any kind of a ritual where that would even matter. So I think that's another reason why it lost all importance. What this was about was the idea of basically opening your heart to God, putting your trust, putting your faith in God, and letting God guide you and having faith that he'll get you to the other side. Our reading for next week, we're going to look at Genesis chapters 18 to 23. If there's any questions that you have from this study or from or you come up with questions actually later in the week, feel free to send an email to questions@Ezekiel 333.com. And what we'll do is I'll pick it up as long as I can grab it before Monday. And then I will make sure that I add that to our study for next week.
For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of the dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Brothers and sisters, the sword is coming. If you hear the watchman's call, please repent and seek out Jesus Christ. There is still time. That at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow.